All right, let's go ahead and begin. Let's get started. Yeah, Derek, will you turn the music down for me? You got it. Um, John MacArthur recently said that one of the most insidious and wicked attacks inside of Christianity is coming from critical race theory. It's something that, if we don't understand it, we could be led astray by a false gospel. And that's what it is. It's a gospel presentation that has a false view of salvation, a false view of sin, a false view of everything. And isn't that how Satan normally works? That he takes something very subtle and he twists it and makes it seem reasonable. And then before we know it, we're far down the path and wondering how we got there. It's one of our privileges. This is the first time we've ever done anything like this, to have Dr. Sunshine come and be with us today. I met Dr. Sunshine a couple of years ago at an event at Genesis called Perspectives, which is a class on the history of missions, from biblical all the way through the history of how missions have gone, and really great class. But I met Dr. Sunshine there, got a chance to talk to him, and the lecture was wonderful. I don't want to put any pressure on you, but it was great. Became friends with Glenn, and then I just noticed him posting things on critical race theory, which was something that I was starting to understand, starting to get a hold of. And I ended up on YouTube and watched a lecture that Dr. Sunshine gave. My mind was just blown. My eyes were open. I was like, this is amazing. We've got to get this at Shepherd's. And then I did what any reasonable person would do. I messaged him on Facebook and said, you got to come to our church. And he's like, who are you? But it's our privilege, it's our pleasure to have Dr. Sunshine here. So if you would you welcome him this morning?
Thank you. After that introduction, I'm kind of anxious to hear what I've got to say. First of all, let me ask you the question. How many of you have heard of critical race theory? Okay, that's most of you. What I'm going to tell you right off the bat is that critical race theory is really a misnomer, because it's not really just about race. Okay. Now, the other thing you got to understand is I'm a historian. And so for me, the best way for you to understand what's really going on with critical theory, critical race theory, and so on, is to look at where the ideas come from. Because if you understand where the ideas came from and you understand how they developed, it will help you make sense of a whole lot of things that, frankly, don't make a lot of sense. Okay, so that's where we're going to begin. Our first slide here, we're looking at, again, the roots of critical theory. Now, I'm using the phrase critical theory rather than critical race theory intentionally. Critical race theory suggests that race is what it's all about. And the fact is that the way the word is being used, the way the phrase is being used on a popular level, race is only one of many elements that are part of the agenda. Now, race is there, and it's sort of the tip of the spear in a lot of ways, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that comes along with it. So I'm using a broader term here, critical theory, to discuss what we're talking about. And the roots of it start with the guy on the right there. That's Karl Marx. Now, Marx, I actually prefer Groucho, but Karl here is the guy who's really important for our purposes. Marx believed that society, that the history of civilization is the history of oppression. And that oppression was based on economic categories. Who has economic power and who doesn't? And he believed that history follows an inevitable process where the people who don't have economic power, gradually more and more of them get economic power, until you get to the point where economic power is spread equally over all of society, which is a communist state, and that's going to be the end of history. This is the trajectory that history moves on. But it's always this battle between the oppressor and the oppressed, the haves and the have-nots. That was Marx's vision of history. And he predicted that there would be an uprising of the proletariat, the urban working classes, the factory workers and things like that, who would seize control of the means of production. They'd take control of the factories, and this was going to be the thing that would move you into the communist utopia. Now, At that point, the guy in your bottom left there, Antonio Gramsci, comes in. Gramsci was an Italian communist between World Wars I and II. Actually died in prison by Mussolini. But Gramsci was completely baffled as to why the communist revolution never happened. Why didn't the workers rise up? And he concluded that the real conflict was not economic, it was cultural. That in fact, the people who have power in society essentially controlled the worldview of society. They determined how everybody saw things, with the net result that the people who were oppressed in society didn't even realize that they were oppressed, because they bought into the ideology of the oppressors. So the solution for Gramsci is to, well, it's not just economic people who are, oppression isn't just economic, it hits a whole lot of other things. So the solution is to try to wake the lower classes up to their oppression. Now, he calls the ideology that drives society, he calls it the hegemony, just a word he used. So the alternative is you need to get the intellectuals and the workers together to create a counter-hegemony, an alternative ideology that would undermine the ideology that dominates the society and therefore lead to freeing the oppressed people. That idea was picked up by the group on the top left. That is the Institute for Social Research at the University of Frankfurt in Germany, known as the Frankfurt School. They picked up on Gramsci's ideas and started to move with them, started to develop them, started to work with them. And then Adolf Hitler came into power. So they moved to Geneva, and then they were invited to the United States, I believe by Dewey, and they relocated to Columbia University. And so the Frankfurt School is really centered in Columbia University. And they start a movement that is known ultimately as the New Left. New because it's sort of neo-Marxism. It's a new version of Marxism, based on Gramsci's ideas, of this idea of it being an ideological rather than an economic struggle. Next slide. Now, anybody who is as old as I am, which is very few of you, will recognize some of the terminology here. What the New Left said is that the problem is there are all of these groups in society that are oppressed. There are blacks, there are women, there are ultimately gay people, and so on. All of these oppressed groups in society have a false consciousness. They have bought into the ideology of their oppressors. So the object then is to raise consciousness by making people aware of the fact that they are oppressed. And what this will then do is lead to class consciousness, which is the root of group identity, identity politics, things like that, where you see yourself primarily in terms of the group that you belong to, rather than as sort of a unique individual and all of those kinds of things. The idea is to develop a counter-hegemony, as Gramsci would say, an alternative worldview so that the people who are oppressed will recognize they're oppressed, and then all of these various oppressed groups will join together to overthrow the system. Okay, that's the program of the New Left, and that is really what's at the root of critical theory. In fact, the term critical theory comes from these guys. Okay, now, turns out, though, we have to add one other wrinkle into this. Next slide. The sexual revolution. It turns out, although we don't really normally recognize this, the term sexual revolution was actually coined by the guy in the bottom left there. That's a guy named Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich was a member of the Frankfurt School, although he got sufficiently weird that they kicked him out. Died in prison, there's a bunch of things there, but he was a psychiatrist. And what he did is follow the ideas of the guy on the top left, that's Sigmund Freud, but mixed them with Marxism. Now, how does this work? Well, Freud says that, okay, society is really built around sexual taboos. He really believed that that was the root of society. The reason is that people, he said, have sex drives that we instinctively want to fulfill, but society says you can't do that. And what this does is two things. First of all, it's what produces mental illness according to Freud, and unhappiness and all of those kinds of things. But on the other hand, it forces people to redirect the energy that they get from their sex drive into new areas. And that redirection of the energy is what produces civilization. That's why you get great artists, architects, all of the different things that drive society forward, drive civilization forward, come from redirecting the sex drive. So one of his main books is called Civilization and Its Discontents. Civilization comes about because of the repression of the sex drive. So you've got a positive with civilization, but you have a negative, its discontents, because it produces unhappiness, mental illness, all those kinds of things. Well, Reich here comes along and combines that with Freud, with Marx. So you get a kind of Freudian Marxism here. And the way this goes is Freud says society comes from repression. Marx says society is oppression. So Reich takes Marx's idea and says, well, if society is really oppression, and Freud is right that it comes from these sexual taboos we've got, the solution to getting rid of oppression has to be found in getting rid of the sexual taboos. And so in the 1930s, he wrote a book called The Sexual Revolution, in which he advocated the complete elimination of sexual taboos and things like that as a way of leading into the Marxist utopia. He argued, with actually Marx himself, that the natural family, husband, wife, children, is the root of bourgeois society, which to a communist is the enemy. And so in order to get rid of bourgeois society, you've got to get rid of the family. And this fits in very nicely with Freud's idea of eliminating sexual taboos and those kinds of things. So you've got to undermine the family, you've got to replace the family, and you've got to have basically a sexual free-for-all. And that's what will lead to the Marxist utopia. And as a Freudian, it's got the additional benefit of eliminating mental illness. He's wrong, okay? Dead wrong. In fact, Freud was wrong, Marx is wrong, they're all wrong. But this is what they believe. And so Reich begins pushing this, and this is picked up by people like the guy on the right there. That's Herbert Marcuse, a key figure in the Frankfurt School. He is going to be one of the people who's going to be pushing this idea of eliminating the natural family as a critical element of leading to this new utopia. Now, next slide. How are they going to do this? Let's talk tactics. The first of them is something called the Long March through the institutions. The term Long March comes from Mao Zedong. Mao did the Long March across China, where his communist forces swept across China and basically turned the whole country communist. The nationalists who were opposing him fled to Taiwan, and through this Long March, Mao conquered China. The guy on the left there, that's Rudi Dutschke. Dutschke used what Mao did and said, what we want is another kind, what we need to get to the communist utopia is a different kind of long march. We need a long march through the institutions. We need to go through the various institutions of society and gradually infiltrate them and convert them into, well, entities that have class consciousness, that are aware of oppression, that have raised consciousness and all these kinds of things. And when we have the institutions, we'll get the society, because the society is built around these institutions. Now, the term Long March of the Institutions is usually associated with Marcuse here, rather than Dutschke. And that's because Marcuse picked up on the terminology and the idea in his book Counter-Revolution and Revolt. He popularizes the term, he popularizes the strategy, and in particular, he believed that the way you turn society around is you focus on the media. If you get control of the media, you will move society in the, well, I would say the right direction, but in his case, it's the left direction, okay? So think about the media in the United States. Would you describe it as being primarily leaning to the right or to the left? And how far left is it? The Long March of the Institutions worked. they've gotten control of the media, but it doesn't stop there. Next. Max Horkheimer, another member of the Frankfurt School, said this: the revolution, remember we're talking Marxism here, the revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move toward universal egalitarianism. So we've got the media. Now we're also going to look at education. We're going to infiltrate the educational system, and we're going to infiltrate politics. And as we gradually transform all of these things, we will move the society to Marxism. Have you taken a look at what's going on in education? He's saying this in the early 70s. This has been a long, systematic approach that these guys have taken to getting control of the levers that move culture. And they've done it, frankly, very successfully. But this isn't the only tactic that they've got. They've got another, there were several others, but the other big one is our next slide. It's a thing called repressive tolerance. Repressive tolerance is a term, again, Marcuse came up with this one. Repressive tolerance is the idea that we should tolerate ideas coming from the left, but not ideas coming from the right. We tolerate liberal ideas, but not conservative ideas. And Marcuse argued that we need this. We need to do this because if people hear arguments, conservative arguments or arguments from the right, it will prevent them from actually objectively considering arguments from the left. So we only give them arguments from the left, and this is in the name of freedom of thought. Okay. So he says this has to take place in education. We only educate people with perspectives from the left. It's going to, indoctrination from the left is perfectly okay, but not from the right. We need to promote this. And even violence needs to be understood and supported if it comes from the left, but not if it comes from the right. Case in point. Think about the treatment that we see in the media of Antifa and the riots, not just the protests, but the riots in the wake of George Floyd. Now, not everything that happened in the protests in the wake of George Floyd were riots, but there were riots. Think about the way those are treated in the media versus what happened in the Capitol. Now, I'm not justifying what happened in the Capitol. That was stupid, and frankly, the people, a lot of it needs to be prosecuted. But that's also true of Antifa, and it's also true of the riots elsewhere. And yet, you have mayors who, when the people are arrested, release them. We're going to tolerate violence from the left, but not the right. Anyone who questions the new left or its agenda cannot be tolerated. They should be silenced, or to use modern terminology, canceled. These ideas, this approach, this strategy has been in place for decades, and it's just now becoming blatant enough to be really obvious. Okay, next slide. Now, most people who deal with critical theory talk about it in terms of cultural Marxism, which is okay, but you need to go beyond that. You need to, in particular, bring in ideas from a movement known as postmodernism. There are a bunch of thinkers here who are important. I'll just narrow it down to one key figure, this guy, French thinker by the name of Michel Foucault. Foucault was really interested, postmodernists are really interested in language. And the reason they're interested in language is, first of all, they don't believe that it is possible to be objective. Objectivity is impossible. What counts as knowledge for them is, number one, subjective. If it's not objective, it's subjective. But number two, it is also very tightly tied to language, because the words we use shape or help determine how we think. Okay, this is something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Don't worry about it. And there are different versions of that out there. So this connection between language, thought, and, well, knowledge, all of these kinds of things is a central issue in postmodernism. The way Foucault took this is you get the impossibility of objective knowledge, but he then takes the next step and says that knowledge, what counts as knowledge in any society, is determined by the people who have cultural power. In other words, the elites in society determine what that society thinks of as knowledge. Okay, so knowledge is well, to go back to Gramsci, knowledge, what you think of as knowledge, is an expression of the hegemony, the people who control the ideology of the society. Now, the difference here is that Gramsci believed that there were things that were objectively true. Foucault doesn't. Further, he's going to take the next step and say that language is a way that the power structures in society reinforce their own power. So the words we use, the expressions we use, all of these things shape our thinking, and all of that is either deliberately or unconsciously designed to maintain the people who have power in power, to maintain their power. So Foucault sees language as being a critical element of the existing power structures. And if, in fact, you are, like Foucault, influenced by the left and you think the power structures are intrinsically oppressive, one of the things you've got to be thinking of is, what do you do with the language? How do you change the language to move things in the right direction? Foucault is also, by the way, going to argue that sex and sexuality are social constructs. He's one of the first people who will do this. This should sound very familiar if you paid any attention to LGBTQIA+ stuff. And he says this is tied to power. It's tied to the existing power structures in society. Thus, society supports heterosexuality because this somehow reinforces the people who already have power. He himself is a homosexual, so this is the way he's arguing this. And thus, the power structures use language and other things to delegitimize LGBTQIA+ people. Okay, so that's Foucault. Foucault comes into the mix with cultural Marxism. He begins shaping a great deal of what's going on in cultural Marxism. Next slide. So you get what I would describe as second generation critical theory. First generation is just the stuff coming out of the Frankfurt School. But what we have here is you've got Gramsci's idea of the hegemony, the cultural ideology, and the calls for a counter-hegemony and alternative ideology. You have the New Left's concept of oppressed classes and identity politics. Add to that Foucault's concept of the use of language to reinforce power. And the result of this is the conclusion becomes language is a tool of the people who control society. It's a tool of the hegemony. It's a tool of the ideology of the oppressors. Therefore, language must be part of the focus of the battle against the people who have power. It's got to be a tool of the counter-hegemony as well. And therefore, you have political correctness. This is what's behind political correctness. Okay? Think about it like this. Okay? I'm going to use a concrete example that I can tell you just from growing up when I grew up. I was born in 1958. So I remember the riots in 1968. I grew up near Newark, New Jersey. My mother taught in Newark. And in between the riots, my mother and father during the day drove us into the area where the riots were taking place to tell us, to show us and say, look, this happened here, this happened there. This is why the riots are happening. You need to understand what the situation is. They actually, I was 10 years old, they took us in and showed us this. When I was a kid, there were certain words that were slurs against black people that were obviously slurs. But there were other terms that were considered perfectly acceptable. A word like Negro. That was an acceptable term in that period. And in fact, it still survives in something like the United Negro College Fund. Still exists. Or referring to blacks as colored people was acceptable. We see this in the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons. Both of those terms were rejected as being prejudicial, as creating bad impressions of black people. And so they began looking for alternate words. So black became popular, except the problem is not all African Americans are black. They've got a range of skin tones. Duke Ellington wrote a piece called Black, Brown, and Beige. Okay, so black was considered, and besides, we talk about the guys with the white hats and guys with the black hats, white magic, black's associated with evil. So we're not going to use black. We'll call them Afro-Americans. And then for some reason, Afro-American was viewed as being inappropriate. So it turned into African Americans. And that one's still okay, but black has made a comeback. But at the same time, although you can't say colored persons, you can talk about persons of color. What's going on here? The reason why you have all of these different terminologies trying to come in is because of the belief that language shapes thought, and therefore, if you want to eliminate prejudice against African Americans, people of color, whatever term you want to use currently, if you want to eliminate discrimination, bigotry, prejudice against them, you do it through controlling language. Because if you can come up with a sufficiently neutral term to describe them, it will be impossible to be bigoted. Because your language itself, it's an attempt, frankly, at reshaping culture, reshaping thought by reshaping language. Okay? That's what's going on through all of this. And that's just one example. Political correctness now extends into all kinds of crazy areas. But the point to note here is that some of this is from a very admirable perspective, but it ends up, the goal is good in some cases, but it ends up leading you into all kinds of other things because of the way it is being used as a tool within this broader ideology. Okay. Next slide. Now, here's where we get into critical race theory proper. We need to be a little bit careful here because critical race theory is used in two different senses today. Critical race theory proper, critical race theory in its technical sense, is a theory of law developed initially primarily by this gentleman, Derek Bell, who was a professor of law at Harvard. What Bell argued, he's somebody who is, by the way, influenced by the Frankfurt School. What Bell argued is that US law is intrinsically white supremacist, that US law is specifically written and designed to protect and to promote the power of whites over blacks. He believes that this is systemic, it is embedded deeply into the entire system of American law. So it's designed to keep blacks in their place. It's designed to keep blacks down. Now, what Bell argues is that, people would, as a counter-argument, well, what do you do with the Civil Rights Act? Blacks have made tremendous strides, haven't they? Bell's argument is interesting. He says, well, advances in civil rights actually only occur when they really benefit white people. Now, that seems, on the face of it, a bit bizarre, but consider as evidence. He says, if you look at State Department communiques during the era of the civil rights movement, what you will find is that the State Department was getting reports from people all over the world saying, look, the issue of how blacks are treated in America is a major foreign policy issue. This is really hurting the US and the US's reputation overseas. We need to do something about this. And so Bell's argument is the civil rights movement was put in place as a way of whites preserving their power, but also their reputation and the power of the United States, meaning the white people in the United States overseas. So the argument may not be quite as strange as it seems. I don't believe he's right, but it's an argument that is made not without at least a certain amount of support. I think that there are other ways of understanding it, but he's got that there. So anyway, that's Bell. And this becomes the basis of critical race theory, which is part of a broader field called critical legal studies, which we don't need to get into. Next slide. Okay, so critical race theory makes there are a couple of different premises, and there are different ways people do this. I'm going to simplify it down to a few of them. First of all, the idea that race is a social construct. That is to say, race does not have any objective reality to it. And the fact of the matter is, they're right. The critical theorists are absolutely right about this. Consider the changing definitions of the word race. I'm a historian, remember? When you go back to the 18th century, you will find discussions of race in which the British race is distinguished from the French race, the German race, and the Italian race. In other words, race was originally almost synonymous with nationality, culture, that kind of thing. Then as you move into the 19th century, things begin to change. And they begin to change for a couple of reasons. One of them is Darwin. One of them is that the European powers are busy trying to figure out an excuse for what they are doing when they're going out and in the neo-colonial period beginning to dominate in Asia and Africa and so many other areas. What justifies them doing this? Well, what they do is they develop an idea that is technically referred to as scientific racism. Scientific racism is actually a way of analyzing humanity, and it divides them up into different categories. There are three primary categories here. By the way, well, I'll show you the connection in a moment. One of them is the Caucasians, Caucasoids. The second are the Asians. The Caucasoids are obvious, Europeans. The second is the Asians, the Mongoloids, named after the Mongols. And the third are the Africans, the Negroids. Okay? In case you're wondering where they get these, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The next point in this is, all right, so we've got these three races. The next point in this is that when you look at Darwin tells you on the basis of survival of the fittest that there are certain individuals or groups that are going to rise to the surface in any population. Remember, Darwin does not refer to competition between species, it refers to competition within a species. Which of this group, which group of ants outcompetes the other so that they survive? Which group of humans outcompetes the other so that they survive? And the argument goes that because Europeans live in such a harsh climate, they had to be tougher and smarter than other people who live in a much, much more gentle climate. I mean, after all, it's so much easier to live in Africa than it is to live in Scandinavia, said people who've never been to Africa. And I'd also like to point out that I spent some time in Mongolia. Remember Mongoloid? Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, is the coldest national capital in the world. The average temperature there is 30 degrees for the year. The average temperature is below freezing. I actually, when I want to complain about the winter here, I actually kept Ulaanbaatar on my weather on my phone, so I could always check what it was there. I've seen it at -40. Yeah, the Europeans are in so much of a harsher climate. Okay. But this argument allows them to use racial thinking to justify their domination of the non-Caucasian peoples of the world. And this is an indication that I see all the time. Anyone who emphasizes race in this sense of the word, anyone who puts a huge emphasis on race inevitably becomes a racist. Now, in case you're wondering, when I say race has no objective identity, or no objective biological marker, think about it like this. No matter what trait that you're going to use to define race, there's no clear breakpoint. So if you're going to use skin color, I've seen people who have skin nearly as black as coal and people who have skin nearly as white as paper, and everything in between. Where do you draw the line? Hair color? Eye color? What are you going to use? There is no biological metric for race. So they're correct. It is a social construct, and it is used to perform a social function. I said, whenever you start putting a lot of emphasis on race, sooner or later it becomes a which one's better. Okay. Now, that brings us to the second point here, definitions of racism. This also has changed over time. When I was a kid growing up, racism was thinking another race was inferior to you or viewing them with contempt or something like that. Then that changed. It changed to add the concept of access to power or having cultural power to it. So it is thinking another race is inferior when you are in a position of strength, when you're in a position of cultural power. Okay? In other words, people who do not have cultural power cannot be racists, which means that whites can be racists and blacks can't. That's where that goes. Now, the problem with this has to do with the notion of what it means to have access to power. Consider, for example, now, this didn't show up first with regard to race. It actually first showed up with reference to feminism. When I was a grad student at the University of Wisconsin, one semester I was a teaching assistant, actually 2 semesters. But the first semester I was a teaching assistant. I had to take I had to take sexual harassment awareness training. Okay, and when I got there, among other things, what they told me is that males were in a unique position to sexually harass women because they had access to institutional power. Okay. Now, as a TA, I was in a classroom that I was TAing European economic history at the time. The class immediately before ours in that classroom was a class that was taught by an endowed chair of women's studies. Now, for those of you who don't know the academic food chain, an endowed chair is as high as you get in academia. There really isn't anything above it. So there's this endowed chair in women's studies, who, by the way, did not allow men into her classes, which I would argue is illegal, but in any event, that we're not going to go there. One day, I'm a chronic reader. I'm an academic. I read everything that gets put in front of me. I used to read cereal boxes, okay? One day, I walked into the classroom, and there were handouts left over from the class in front of it. One of the handouts said it was about pornography. And one of the main statements in it is pornography is a textbook teaching men how to treat women. I looked at that and said, well, okay. Now, at this sexual harassment training workshop, I heard this thing about institutional power and all of that. So I went up to, during the break, I went up to the guy who was leading this, and I said to him, I'm not putting in a complaint here. This is not a complaint. I just would like clarification. And I told him about this handout. And I said to him, now, if I were stupid enough to make a statement as idiotic as Harlequin romances are textbook teaching women how to have relationships with men, I could be brought up on sexual harassment charges, right? He said, oh yeah, absolutely. I said, so what's the difference between that and what the professor handed out? He said to me with a straight face, well, you have access to institutional power. Now think about this. I'm a grad student TA. She's an endowed chair. Which of us has access to institutional power? She could have crushed me like a bug if she wanted to, except I think I was beneath her notice. This idea of what constitutes access to institutional power is problematic, okay? But it goes beyond that. So the newer definition, you can't be a racist unless you have access to institutional power, therefore only whites can be racist, moves to the next step where you get people like Robin DiAngelo, white fragility, whites are racist, period. Because you have access to institutional power, you are implicit in a racist system, therefore you're racist. That's where this goes. Now, that is not academic critical race theory. It's not academic, it's not critical race theory in the formal sense, but it is the way critical race theory gets translated on the popular level. And Robin DiAngelo's book is mandatory reading in a lot of anti-discrimination kinds of workshops and places around. And if you don't want that one, it's Anti-Racism by Ibram Kendi that makes essentially the same kind of argument. The cultural hegemony, to put it in Gramscian terms, really revolves around white supremacy and white privilege. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but basically what it's saying is that the whole system is rigged to make it beneficial to whites and to hold back anybody else. Okay. Like I said, we'll return to some elements of this later. Now, one of the reasons why I need to emphasize the distinction between critical race theory as an academic theory, as part of critical legal studies, and the way it is applied popularly with Ibram Kendi, with Robin DiAngelo, with Black Lives Matter, all of these kinds of things. One of the reasons why I have to emphasize that is something that's technically known as the Mott and Bailey fallacy. Mott and Bailey is a castle design from about the year 1000. Okay. The word motte is an Old English word meaning a mound. So what they would do is they would dig a ditch and pile up all the dirt in a mound. You'd put a palisade around a larger area with the mound inside it, and that's called the bailey or the courtyard. And so you've got a mound and a courtyard, mound and motte and bailey. And on top of the mound, you would build the keep. This is the final stronghold. If everything else falls, this is the place that you can defend yourself from. Okay, so that's a Mott and Bailey castle. A Mott and Bailey fallacy is when people are using a word like critical race theory in the broad sort of popular sense, someone like Kendi or DiAngelo, or those are the two big ones, when they're using it that way, that's like the Bailey. And if you start attacking the arguments there, what they do is they retreat to the mound. They go to the keep on the top of the mound and they say, oh, no, that's not what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is part of critical legal studies. Case in point, they're teaching critical race theory in schools. Oh, no, we're not. We're not teaching critical race theory in schools. That's part of critical legal theory. We don't get any legal theory in elementary school. That's only something that happens in law schools. Yeah, except for the fact that critical race theory is something much bigger than just critical legal studies now. Okay, so be aware that that's a standard tactic that is used when these things are criticized, particularly in the area of public schools, but even in other areas as well. Okay, so in any event, those are some of the key elements of critical race theory, but we're not done. Next slide. This is Kimberly Crenshaw, another important younger theorist on critical race theory. Crenshaw is important, a major contributor to a lot of elements in critical race theory, and she is in fact one of the ones who's honest enough to admit that its roots are in Marxism. But she also is the one who really promotes an idea called intersectionality. Intersectionality is really looking at the ways that oppression works for different oppressed groups. So, case in point, if you're black, you are oppressed. If you are a woman, you are oppressed. If you are a black woman, you are oppressed more than a white woman because you're getting it both for being black and for being a woman. Okay, so there's an intersection of different categories. That's what intersectionality is about in its origin. Next slide. So the way this works is you start with a series of what I would describe as approved categories of oppression. There are certain ones that they ignore. Oddly enough, poverty tends to be one of them, especially with something with roots on Marxism. Why do I say that? They are utterly unconcerned about white coal miners in Appalachia. So poverty is not a category that they use. Okay. Instead, it starts with race, particularly in critical race theory. Then you add sex. This is what Kimberly Crenshaw did, those two. Then chronologically, you add lesbian and gay to that, maybe bisexual. And most recently, you add transgender to it. So what you see is these, and there are others as well, these are the primary ones. You have these categories of oppression, and intersectionality says that your identity really is found in where you fit. You're either an oppressor or an oppressed in each of these categories. So how do these different things, your status as oppressor or oppressed, fit together? So for example, the example I used before, oppression of blacks, oppression of women, and oppression of black women. Well, what that means is that a black man is oppressed because he's black, but he's an oppressor because he's a man. And if he's a cisgendered heterosexual, then he's an oppressor because of those things as well. A black woman is more oppressed because she's oppressed as both a black and a woman, but assuming she's cisgender heterosexual, she is an oppressor in those categories. Now, I don't like the terminology, but I'm using it just for the sake of that. If she's a black lesbian, that ups the ante. Suddenly she's oppressed as both a black, a woman, and a lesbian. And transgender sort of crowns them all. Okay. Now, why is that important? Next slide. Okay, summary of intersectionality. Intersectionality is kind of a weird idea in a lot of ways when looked at from the perspective of the history of philosophy. Because one of the main things in philosophy historically, particularly in the area of metaphysics, is, in other words, what's real, is the issue of whether something, it's the issue of universals in particular. So the way this applies here is, there are no universals in intersectionality, there are no universals about humanity. There's no such thing as a universal human nature, okay? Basically, all we are is a product of various intersectional categories. There's nothing universal that unites us. We're also not individuals. You are simply the product of your intersectional categories. You think of yourself as an individual, but everything that's significant about you is determined by the intersectional categories you belong to in intersectionality. So your entire identity is really based on how all of these various categories of oppression or oppressor intersect in your life. Now, the reason this is important is actually our next slide. Ooh, not yet. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting my order here. Intersectionality also fits in with standpoint theory. Now, standpoint theory is an approach to, I'm sorry about this philosophical term, epistemology. That is to say, how you know things. It's a theory of knowledge, okay? And the origin is this woman, Sandra Harding. It begins with feminist epistemology. And where this goes is it says that what you think of as knowledge, that's a phrase that should ring bells because we talked about it with Foucault and postmodernism. What you think of as knowledge comes from your intersectional categories. So if you are a white, you think one way. If you are a black, you think a different way. If you're a man, you think one way. If you're a woman, you think a different way, and so on. Whites in particular value objectivity. They value facts and evidence and statistics and numbers and science and all of those kinds of things. All of those are identified as characteristics of whiteness. People of color, in contrast to that, people of color have lived experiences which are self-validated and self-interpreted. And these lived experiences are things that qualify as truth for them. And the thing about this is, neither is superior to the other. So the lived experience of African Americans, to use the group that is most often cited here, is just as valid as any kind of statistics, numbers, proof, or evidence that a white person might marshal in argument against what they see as their lived experience. Now, further, we have to take this one step further. Since whites control the culture, whites naturally understand their own culture. Minorities have to live in that culture, so they need to understand white culture, but they also have their own lived experience. So they have a broader base of approaches to knowledge to draw from than whites do, and therefore minorities tend to have a superior understanding of the world. Now, if this sounds a little strange to you, next slide, we see this in spades in Sonia Sotomayor in her testimony before Congress when she was, or before the Senate, before her confirmation. She said this: "I would hope that a wise Latina woman with the richness of her experiences," standpoint, "would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that life." Now, people looked at that and said, what? But it is a perfect expression of what standpoint theory is about. As a Latina, that is to say, a female person from the Latinx culture, she has experience as a woman that the white male doesn't. She has experience as in the Latinx culture that a white anything doesn't. And therefore, because of that kind of experiential knowledge, self-validated, self-interpreted, that she has there, and because she already knows how to work within white culture, she has a much richer, well, how does she say it? Richness of her experiences. She has a much richer base to draw from in order to reach conclusions. That's standpoint theory in action. Okay, so these are the key elements, formal elements of critical theory. Let's move to the next one. What nobody talks about in connection with critical theory is that they view everything in the world as a zero-sum game. What a zero-sum game is a zero-sum game says that in order for one person to advance, another person has to be pushed down. So, it's not just that you score points, it's that when you score points, you're taking the points away from the other person. Okay, that's a zero-sum game. It's most frequently used in economics. You hear the argument that the super rich, the 1% out there, own so much wealth, and because they have all of this wealth, the rest of the people are impoverished. The poverty is caused by people with having too much wealth. There are cases where that's true, but they're mostly in global south countries, developing countries. The metaphor that they use is that if one person takes a big piece of the pie, there is less pie available for everybody else. The problem is we don't just have one pie, we have bakeries. And the net result is, frankly, this is bad economics. Any economist will tell you this makes no sense in economics. But it's applied economically in many cases, but it is also applied literally to every other area of life. Anybody who has any sort of advantage or privilege or dominant position got that by oppressing someone else. Western civilization dominates the globe. Why? Because it has oppressed non-Western civilizations. Men have power because they have oppressed women. Whites have power because they've oppressed people of color, and so on. Okay? Now, here's the trick. It's not just power and things like that. And by the way, critical theory is all about power, in case you haven't picked that up. That's really the central theme of this. It's not just power that is involved in a zero-sum game. It's also moral authority. Because you see, if you are in an oppressor category, you lose moral authority because oppression is evil. But since it's a zero-sum game, when you lose moral authority, the oppressed gain moral authority. And when you add intersectionality, the more oppressed categories you can be in, the more moral authority you have. Next slide. So your identity, again, is defined by your intersectional categories. You lose moral authority from oppressor categories. You gain moral authority from oppressed categories. More oppressed categories, you have more moral authority. Now, here's the thing. In this system, oppression is sin, and in fact, oppression is the only sin. Therefore, only oppressors sin. If there is any possibility of salvation for an oppressor, it consists in becoming what's described as woke, a term, by the way, that is taken from the African American community, so it's really cultural appropriation. Or if you prefer the LGBTQIA plus terminology, it's becoming an ally. Okay. In other words, you have to. The only possibility of salvation is for the oppressor to recognize that they are oppressors, that this is all evil, and to accept the entire critique of the system, buy into critical theory, and thus basically accept the counter-hegemony. Okay. Some versions of critical theory don't let you do this. So Robin DiAngelo, if you're white, you are racist. You can never do anything about it. There's no amount of apology or anything else you can do, but you should do it anyway. Okay. Now, what they don't understand is that this is a recipe for creating white supremacists. Think about it. If you are white and you are an oppressor and there's nothing you can ever do about this, you can never escape your guilt, why would you even bother accepting that system? Why would you ever bother thinking it was appropriate to share power? Why not reinforce it? If you don't have a Christian ethic, that seems to me, frankly, to be the logic of it. Anyway, continuing on. This is what, next slide, this is what creates the seemingly incoherent alliances that you get in the identity politics realm. I refer to this as creating communities of virtuous victimhood, because if you're a victim, you're virtuous, you say. So women are victims of male oppression, LBG and so on are victims of heteronormative oppression, people of color are victims of white oppression, Muslims are victims of Western oppression, pagans are victims of Christian oppression, undocumented workers are victims of American oppression, the poor are victims of corporate oppression, and get this, the planet is a victim of industrial oppression. And so when you look at this, what you see is the identity politics and the dark green ecology stuff. You see the formula here. This is why you will find LGBTQ plus activists opposing Islamophobia, despite the fact that if they were in a Muslim country, they would be stoned or thrown off a building. This is why you see women supporting, opposing Islamophobia, feminists opposing Islamophobia, despite the fact that women can't drive in Saudi Arabia. Okay. These weird coalitions that form because of the idea from intersectionality that all oppression is the same. And thus all of these groups, because they have experienced oppression, have got virtue, and they're basically fighting the same battle against oppression. It creates, frankly, some rather incoherent alliances. If you think about LGBT by itself, lesbians and gays historically never really got along. The only time they began to get along was in the wake of the sexual revolution. They identified heterosexuality as the enemy, so they united to fight a common enemy. When you add transgender into that, it's even more coherent, because if gender is completely a social construct and you can be male or female as you choose, how do you become a lesbian or gay? They don't really go together. It's incoherent. It's what a sociologist named Philip Reith called a death work. And by that, what he meant is it's aimed at tearing something down. There's no positive thing that it's really advocating or pushing for. It's really aimed at destruction. And a lot of the stuff we see here is, in Reith's terminology, death works. Okay, but anyway, moving on. Question: why is this so popular? The fact of the matter is, this is the dominant worldview in a lot of the world right now. It's dominating HR departments in business, it's dominating the universities, it's coming into elementary school classrooms, they're promoting this in the US military, it's essentially the worldview of the Democratic Party and a significant part of the Republican Party. Okay, why is it so popular? I would suggest that there are a number of reasons for this. One of them is there are elements of truth here. We live in a fallen world. Fallen people create fallen institutions. Sin embeds itself in every human institution. Therefore, we should not be surprised at finding sin in pretty much anywhere. Okay? There are elements of truth here. The fact of the matter is, although I don't think every example for, to pick the black community, I don't think every example of what the disadvantages that show up in the black community, the problems that you see there, I don't think all of it is a result of racism. Some of it is. We've got to be honest about this. Okay, so there are in fact elements of truth there. There are some elements of truth in methodology. We do, to a degree, see the world based on our own personal experiences, the culture we came up in, and all of those kinds of things. There's elements of truth there. That doesn't mean, however, where it fails, is that doesn't mean that there's no objective truth. So there are elements here that you can grab hold of and say, you know, there's a point there. The second reason it's popular, I think, is emotional appeal. It's hard, it is really hard to watch some of the videos that have come out, like with George Floyd or any number of other people. The video evidence that has come out in a number of these cases is really hard to watch. And it properly should outrage us. Standpoint theory. The problem with this, by the way, and the emotional appeal, is that standpoint theory argues that the emotional appeal is as true as anything else. The lived experience of people in the black community, their reaction to these things, is just as true as any counter evidence you might be able to supply, and in fact it's also more powerful. Because you see evidence, emphasis on evidence, objectivity, and things like that are whiteness. So we've got a difficulty in dealing with it, trying to respond there. But there's an emotional appeal too. The other thing, though, that is worth noting particularly is that it's parasitic on Christianity. What do I mean? Wokeness is a Christian heresy. If you read books by an atheist like Tom Holland, who wrote a book called Dominion, what he says in this book is, he's an ancient historian, and when he looks at ancient history, he finds it impossible to really understand or sympathize with these people. Because the level of cruelty that they exhibit, sort of casual cruelty, is stunning. Their complete disregard for any right or value in the underprivileged. It's just, he finds it baffling. And he tried to figure out why this was the case. And he looked at cultures all over the world, and it's the same all over the world. He says the only difference is Christianity. Christianity is what made us recognize the value of the underprivileged person, the value of people who are weak or who are poor, that they have intrinsic inherent dignity. This is a Christian idea that has come into the world. Therefore, oppression is sin. It's not the only sin, but it is sin. And what CRT does is it takes this idea of oppression, picking on people who are less powerful or less influential or whatever than you are. It is sinful. They pick that up and run with it, so that becomes the centerpiece of everything. This is quite literally heresy. The word heresy comes from the Greek word hairein, which means to choose. What's that got to do with it? Well, the idea here is that you choose one idea that is true within the faith, and you grab it and you run with it so far that it distorts everything else. Think about a sweater where you grab one of the threads on the sweater and pull it and the whole sweater distorts. That's what heresy is, and that's what CRT is. It's picking up on truth from Christianity and running with it. And particularly in our culture, which has been so heavily influenced by Christianity, we recognize the fact that oppression is sin, and we instinctively want to deal with it, want to do something about it. The problem is their solution, creates real difficulties, especially for a Christian. Next slide. Where CRT goes wrong. I'm going to use a bunch of theological categories here. So anthropology, it's not just a field in the social sciences, it has to do with the doctrine of man, theologically. Its anthropology is wrong. They're correct. Race is not a biological category. It's a social construct, but it is also not a biblical category. The Bible doesn't talk about people in terms of race. The closest it gets is Jews and Gentiles. Okay? That has to do with your relationship with God. In fact, what the Bible tells us is that the single thing that is most important about each and every human being you will ever meet is that they are made in the image of God. Now that's got there's a lot to unpack there. That's a whole weekend seminar. But the point here is that human value, human worth in Scripture is based on the fact that human beings are made in the image of God. In Genesis 9:6, God says to Noah, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, because man is made in the image of God." Again, there's a lot to unpack here, but the term image of a God in the ancient Near East meant that you were claiming to be that God's official representative on earth. So in Genesis, where it says human beings are made in the image of God, let us make man in our image and let him have dominion, those two are the same thing. It's parallelism in Hebrew. Being made in the image of God means you are God's rep on earth. Therefore, an attack on a person is an attack on the God in whose image they are made, which is why whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Not to put too fine a point on it, but anytime you place anything ahead of the image of God in determining human value or human worth, you are committing idolatry, and you are frankly insulting God to his face. Period. And yet critical theory is based on the idea that what we are is our intersectional categories. That these are the things that determine value. These are the things that determine who has moral authority and who doesn't. All of those kinds of things. It fails on anthropology. It also fails on hamartiology, a really obscure word that refers to the doctrine of sin. Are the oppressed really innocent? All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All are in need of salvation. The oppressors aren't the only sinners out here. And yet, that's fundamentally what critical theory argues. They also make the argument that their evidence for this is disparate outcomes. In other words, if two different groups have different outcomes, the only possible explanation for that is oppression. My response is, oh really? Case in point. If you look cross-culturally around the world, meta-studies of these meta-analyses of the studies that have been done show that universally children do better statistically when they are raised by their biological parents who are married. That is a universal. Yet if you look at a group like Black Lives Matter or any number of the other groups that are out there, they make the argument that the only reason why that is true is because the system is rigged to benefit those families. In a truly fair world, it wouldn't matter whether you were raised by your biological parents or somebody else. It wouldn't matter whether you were raised by a male and a female, two females, two males, or multiples, a village, anything like that. It should all produce exactly the same outcomes. No, because that is a violation of the way God made us. Oppression isn't the only reason why you get disparate outcomes, and yet that's fundamental to their arguments. So it's not just the anthropology or the hamartiology that's a problem. Next, we also have soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. There is in critical theory no possibility of grace, and frankly, logically, no possibility of redemption. This is, again, the idea that if you're white, you're automatically a racist. And its eschatology is really lacking as well. What you have here is what, again, Philip Reith, the guy who coined the term deathworks, he calls this an anti-culture. It is really based primarily on eliminating what's there rather than presenting a positive vision or program for how you reach it and what the final destination actually looks like. Basically, given the insistence that although race is a social construct, it is a natural thing and there's nothing that you can do about it, the only way that you can really deal with racism Well, you can't really deal with racism, but the only thing you can do is replace one set of oppressors with another, because everything's a zero-sum game. So there's no real eschatological vision either. There's no doctrine of the future. It doesn't really offer hope. Okay, next. It also fails on a couple of other levels. Epistemology, again, the branch of philosophy dealing with how you know stuff. The fact is, objective truth does exist. You know, that's not whiteness. The same, you know, they're talking about, in Seattle schools, they're talking about math being whiteness, and insisting on getting the correct answer is really not appropriate because that's a white value. I got news for you. The same math that builds a bridge in the United States will build one in Africa. There is objective reality. There is objective truth. Not all worldviews are equal. Example, when I was in college, I spent a summer in Norman, Oklahoma, and I volunteered I was in a program, it's part of my undergrad degree. But on Sundays, I joined some people going into a federal prison to do some ministry there. And I got to know a guy in there. I was a musician, he was a musician, we talked guitar, things like that. And he was a Hispanic guy with a lot of Native American in him. That's going to be important in a second. And at lunch one day, after I'd been hanging out with this guy, somebody asked me, says, you know what he's in for? I said, no, didn't come up. Said, drug offenses and murder. Said, in fact, one day, because of some things drawn from his background in sort of the Native American cultural things, he decided that he was immune to the white men's bullets and went to walk out of the prison. The guards disobeyed their orders to shoot to kill and instead shot his legs out from under him, and he spent months in the hospital having them rebuilt. Which worldview conforms more closely to reality? Not all worldviews are equal. Okay. Another failure here. Variety, another one, varieties of black lived experiences. Not all blacks have the same lived experience. You know, you can go to Thomas Sowell, you can go to Clarence Thomas, you can go to any number of very successful black people, black scientists, black mathematicians, and so on. Carol Swain, and there are any number of them that we can point to, and they don't have the same experience of the world as critical race theory says they should. And the way they get around this is they say there's a difference between a black person and a person who happens to be black. A person who happens to be black is someone who's bought into white culture and is bought into its lies, whereas the only authentic black person is the one who's oppressed. I don't buy it. You also, and this was pointed out by Wilfred Riley, who is a professor of political science, black professor of political science in a historically black school in Kentucky. Professor Riley said that, historically black college, I should say specifically. Professor Riley said that, you know, the fact that racism isn't the only problem affecting the black community is demonstrated by a number of things, one of which is that parallel problems exist in poor white communities. You know, many of the pathologies you see in inner city black communities, you will also find in poor white communities. So that suggests the issue isn't racism, it's poverty. Okay. So, but they have no way of explaining that, or they don't ever bother explaining it. Then there are sociological problems. They ignore social class. Social class really has relatively little to do with the way they analyze things. They ignore family structures. I've already talked about that. Wilfred Riley points out that immigrants from Africa don't have the same pathologies in their communities as African Americans do. There's something else happening there in the community that cannot be explained simply by race. And lastly, it ignores Asians. Asians succeed at a much higher level than they should according to critical race theory because they're people of color and oppressed minority. Now, the way they get around this is they say they're white adjacent, meaning they're very close to being whites. And, but what that ignores is, for example, do you know what ethnic group has the highest income in the United States? Indians. really tough to make that argument. Everybody thinks of the Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, but it's actually the Indians. Okay, so the bottom line here is there are all kinds of things that we can critique about this. I think it's dead wrong on a whole lot of levels. So how do we respond to it? Next slide. Oh, a couple more. This is just sort of my summary statement here. I would say that the thing that I am most personally bugged by with critical race theory is that they deny agency to minorities. That is to say, they deny minorities the ability to do anything about their situation. All they are victims of the whites. I don't believe that. I believe that the black community has got far more energy and creativity and far more things that they can do. If they don't buy into this, there are a lot more things that can happen. But what this says, it completely denies them agencies. It rejects the idea of purposes in nature. LGBT is a great example of this. There are natural ends in biology. You know, the things that are involved in sexuality are called the reproductive system for a reason. That's their purpose. And yet the whole LGBT thing completely denies that. And they also apply the wrong solutions. Let me give you an example of something concrete here. Driving while black. I've talked to any number of young black men who talk about being pulled over regularly for things that white people aren't pulled over for. It's a real problem. It does happen. Now, we can talk about all the reasons why police might do this. I don't care about that. If you are a young black man and you are innocent and you keep getting pulled over where your white counterpart doesn't, what do you begin to think? The police have it in for us. Whatever the reason is, whatever reasons they may give, that is going to create a real distinct impression that the police have it in for you, and for good reason. So the question is, what is the solution to driving while black? We've got two solutions here. Critical race theory, because everything is a zero-sum game. Critical race theory would suggest that the solution is to start pulling white people over for exactly the same non-reasons that you pull blacks over for. The alternative is to not see the world as a zero-sum game, spread privilege, and stop pulling the blacks over for things you wouldn't pull a white person over for. Which solution makes more sense? I'd say it's the latter. It's pretty obvious. And this is exactly what Martin Luther King was fighting for. That blacks should be treated the way whites are treated. It's not a zero-sum game. It could be done. But it's also worth noting that critical race theorists look down on Martin Luther King, many of them, for this reason. Okay, so next solution, next slide. How do we respond? The first thing I would say is take a deep breath. I do this presentation a lot, or variants of it, and what I hear from a lot of people is, I'm scared. There's no reason to be scared. Jesus is still raised from the dead. God is still on the throne. God is still sovereign over the affairs of humanity. God is the one who determines the rise and fall of nations. And even if he's determined that this is the fall of our nation, and I don't know that he has, but even if that were the case, he still promises that all things work together for our good. So there's absolutely no reason to be afraid. There's no reason to let this stuff bug you. I mean, we need to respond to it, but we need to respond to it appropriately. But the first thing we have to keep in mind is God still large and in charge. Okay, next. First thing in terms of practical, nuts and bolts responses is we need to recognize that CRT advocates are not our enemy. The enemy is our enemy. Okay? The enemy being, of course, Satan. We need to think of CRT advocates or anybody who opposes the gospel as people who are caught in the Stockholm Syndrome. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a phenomenon that happens with prisoners of war and kidnap victims and things like that, where they, as a way of dealing with the psychological pressure of their captivity, flip sides. They become collaborators. Okay? It's a well-known phenomenon among psychologists. And the fact of the matter is, anyone who opposes the gospel is not the enemy, is a victim of the Stockholm Syndrome. They are not the target for defeat. They are, in fact, someone who needs rescuing. So what we need to do is have a two-pronged response here. The first of them is recognize that Satan is still very much active and very much behind a lot of this stuff, and we need to engage in spiritual warfare. This is, Ephesians 6 is one of the classic passages of this where it talks about the armor of God and all of those kinds of things. We can look at a number of other passages from Paul and elsewhere. But one thing I would like to highlight that people tend to ignore in Ephesians 6 is after it goes through the metaphor of all the pieces of armor, in about 2 verses, Paul uses words referring to prayer something like 6 times. So put on all this armor and pray, 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 pray. It's inescapable if you actually pay attention that Paul's real focus is on the importance and the significance of prayer. So make sure you're praying. And then we've got to think about deprogramming. How do you get through to people who have been captured by the enemy? The challenge that we're facing is that, again, as I mentioned before, reason, evidence, and things like that are seen as examples of white supremacy. And they also, if you, again, look at Robin DiAngelo, you're in what's known as a Kafka trap. And that comes from a book called The Trial by Kafka, a surrealist author. And basically, the way this goes is you are accused of being a racist. If you agree with it, you're a racist. If you deny it, that's proof you're a racist. That's a Kafka trap. And that's literally what Robin DiAngelo does. So we've got a challenge facing that. And then we also have what Vodi Balcom talks about as ethnic Gnosticism. If you're a member of a minority community, you have intrinsic knowledge of what racism is that's invisible to a white. So if a minority accuses you of racism, you are a racist even though you don't have any racist intentions or don't think of you as yourself as a racist. You are a racist because that person has secret knowledge based on their lived experience. So we've got to deal with the problem of ethnic Gnosticism. So how do you address it when you're faced with these kinds of very specific and very concrete challenges? Next slide. First of all, don't do a head-on attack. Instead, build relationships. You do this with individuals, you do this with communities, and particularly for those of us in the white community, never have the audacity to try to present yourself as the one with the solutions to the problems. You don't actually know enough to understand the problems in the minority community. You need to let them educate you and lead you. Okay? But relationships here are critical because when you are in a relationship with a person, it is much harder for you to be just simply thrown into a category. It's much harder for intersectionality to actually block real communication. Ask questions. The importance of asking questions cannot be overstated. This is true for a wide range of things. First of all, the person who asks questions controls the conversation. You don't want to be the one giving answers, you want to be the one asking questions. And secondly, unless you actually understand, you are never going to be able to effectively interact with another person. So learn from them. And also important, weep with those who weep. Don't do things like say, well, the statistics show that, it isn't really open season on blacks on the part of white police officers when somebody's just been killed. Don't do that. We need to weep with those who weep. Okay, next. Francis Schaeffer said, love is the ultimate apologetic. We must speak the truth. We cannot compromise on speaking the truth, but equally we cannot compromise on speaking the truth in love. There's a challenge here as well. Lack of affirmation is often seen as hate. If you do not affirm me as a gay man or as a transgender woman, that shows that you hate me. That's really not what hate is. But that's the challenge we have to face. You're going to see this. This is why I would argue that building relationships is primary. It's harder to make the accusation of hate in the context of a relationship. And we got 1 John 3:18, little children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. The importance of how we treat others is critical. Like I said, in our daily life, we're not going to be typically in a position where we're going to be able to affect significant change in a worldview that is coming to dominate the culture. But that's not our job. Our job is to do what we can do. And that begins, as Chuck Colson used to say, over the fence in your backyard, talking to your neighbor, at a barbecue, at those kinds of things. It is building the relationships where you demonstrate your love and respect for other people, where you honor the image of God in them, and you treat them well even when they treat you badly. That is going to be the key to begin to heal these things that are genuinely wrong in our culture and in our churches. And it will begin also addressing the sin that is at the root of a lot of the complaints that are being made, the proper things that are being objected to within critical theory. Okay, I believe that was the last one. Oh, okay, yeah, my for more information slide. Okay, so I have no idea how long I went. Any questions? And I refuse, by the way, to believe that I was so clear that there won't be any.
Yeah, first, if we could, just a thank you to Dr. Sunshine. It's fantastic. And in order, so the session's been recorded, and so in order for us to capture, continue to capture the essence of this conversation, we have a microphone in the back, so if you do have questions, if you could head back there and speak into the microphone so that we could capture the question for the recording as well as the answer, that would be very much appreciated. So, David, you're up first, it seems. Chomping at the bits back there.
That's right. Hey, thank you very much. So what do you say when you're in the conversation, you're developing a relationship with someone where you are worlds apart, but there's a friend of mine where I've asked tons and tons of questions, and I have pretty clearly articulated to them what they believe. He knows that I know that he knows that I'm aware of what his position is, and we have a great relationship. He's incredibly anti-WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. I learned that term from him. And then eventually it got to the point where he said, well, what do you believe? I kind of shared what I believed, and it was so, is disparate the right word? We're so far apart. It was a very amicable conversation, but it was so clear. There was almost no common ground at all. Where do you go at that point when you have a relationship and there's even a desire to continue the conversation, but I was kind of at the end of, it's like, I don't have any more questions. You got to believe in Jesus. I don't know where do you go from there?
So tell me, what is the end game here? I'm giving you sample questions. So what is the end game here? What is it that you think the ideal society would look like, and how do we get there? That would be a really good question. And what you would find is, well, it would be a society in which there wouldn't be any more oppression at all, something like that. There wouldn't be any whatever. Okay. Well, how do we get there if you hate WASPs? How does this happen? You're telling me that you hate a group, and yet you're also telling me you want everything to be level and equal. How does this work? How do these things fit together? That kind of question, how does this fit with that, is a really good way of sort of putting a pebble in their shoe. Okay. The other thing is, I prefer asking questions, but you could say, as a Christian, I believe that everybody's made in the image of God, which means everybody's got equal intrinsic dignity. It seems to me that that would be a lot better foundation for building a just society, if it were actually followed through, than what you're suggesting. You hate WASPs. How are you going to do this? So things along those lines would be how I would approach it. The bigger problem, by the way, comes when you have family members or something like that who you're in relationship with who disown you because you don't agree with them. And under those circumstances, I would argue that the relationship was not as strong as it should have been in the first place, because if those kinds of things will divide you from family members or old friends, their ideology is more important than the relationship, and then all you can do with that is pray.
How do I, as a parent with 2 girls in a public school system, be able to find out what it is that they're learning and then, I'll say, combat that information when I don't have that experiences that they are having today? Like my experiences going through a public school system was different. How do I go about that?
Yeah, the first thing is you need to find out what they're learning. And you can get that. You can contact the school board, you can contact the school, you can contact the teachers, ask them for the curriculum, those kinds of things. You can also work very hard at home to raise your kids understanding the biblical worldview, and particularly, I cannot overemphasize the importance of helping them to understand the image of God and what its implications are. Okay. So we agree that mistreatment of people is wrong. We disagree on what the roots of that are, and we disagree on what the solution is. But we agree that this is wrong. We agree because of this. This is the reason. It's because everyone is made in the image of God. Everyone has equal intrinsic dignity, and it doesn't matter whether they're black, white, Asian, Native American, whether they're handicapped, whether they're physically or mentally handicapped. None of these things matter. Everybody is valuable. Everybody is made in the image of God, and we need to honor each person that way. That, I think, most kids will recognize. My suspicion is most kids, and then if you live that out at home too, most kids will end up recognizing that as really a better way of approaching it. And you can actually address the issues directly as well as you learn what they are.
Awesome.
You can also ask your kids what they're learning. Let them tell you.
Yeah, that's how we've been approaching it first, but
you
comes back and says, well, I don't know.
You can do additional research by asking the teachers, asking the school board.
Thank you.
As you think about the long march through history, where are we at in that march? And are there any effective counter-revolutions? Is it too late? And if no, what should we do? Same question for yes.
Yeah, there was an anthropologist, Unger, I think was the name. I'd have to do a little bit of going back on this, who did studies on the collapse of civilization. And although he attempted to disprove this thesis, what was very clear, what he could not disprove, and all of the evidence pointed to this, is that when you hit a point in a society where there is the kind of sexual chaos and confusion, rejection of marriage, all of those kinds of things, you are 3 generations away from societal collapse. Universally. We are well past that point. Now, what I will say is that in Britain in the 18th century, they were also at a very bad place. 25% of the women in the city of London were prostitutes. Okay. That turned around because of the evangelical revival. We usually associate it with the Methodists, but there are a number of different branches of it. The evangelical revival and the very pointed work of the Clapham sect with people like William Wilberforce at its head. They created a situation, they promoted a situation in England where there was a widespread revival of faith, as Wilberforce put it, a reformation of manners, which really refers to a reformation of the way we interact with each other, morality, all of those kinds of things, and it saved Britain. That's the only example I know of historically that I can point to. It can happen, but what it takes is a lot of very serious, uncompromising Christians who, among other things, place prayer at the center of what they do. Apart from that, apart from divine action, I don't really see how the United States survives on the basis, or for that matter, most Western cultures survive on the basis of what this anthropologist discovered as he's looked at civilizations across history.
Don't you think the church needs to be in community?
Yeah, that's part of it as well. The church has a critical role here, and we need to exist, frankly, in a way we don't, as intentional communities of mutual support for each other. You know, when someone loses their job because they won't bow to HR on CRT, we need to be there to support them. You know, those kinds of things. So we need to have intentional communities to provide a living model for a better way of life. You know, Archbishop Chaput, now deceased from Chicago, said that he thought that he would die in his bed, his successor would die in a prison cell, and his successor would die as a martyr in the public square. And his successor would help pick up the pieces of a broken civilization and rebuild it the way the church has throughout history. We need to be thinking about being that fourth archbishop, being the church that will pick up the pieces. On that cheery note, other questions? Okay.
I have more of maybe a statement. Mine's more of a statement. I'm in New Hampshire, southern New Hampshire. And last year I started getting pretty involved politically. And New Hampshire actually made it illegal to teach CRT in New Hampshire schools. I guess there's a bunch of teachers that are vowing to still teach it. So now what they're going to do is try to see how they can you get rid of the teachers, you know, fire the teachers. But I think one of the things that we're doing in our district is telling people get involved in your school committees, become part of your school committee, know what's going on, because I think that's what happened, that they infiltrated the school committees and indoctrinating these children. I'm actually thinking of running for school committee myself. But I think that that's what we need to do. We need to get in there. You need to get out. You need to get into the political arena. You need to know. I don't know how Massachusetts all runs, but I'm learning New Hampshire. New Hampshire just opened up last Monday all the bills that are going to go forth January 2022. By Tuesday, all the bills that hit in 2 days, there were 412 LSRs, those are whatever, the bills that are gonna hit. I'm like, wow, I learned this last year, like 800 bills went in January, that the House bills only, that they had to vote on. And it's insane, the stuff that goes on, but most people don't understand how everything works. I don't know how, but I would encourage Christians to start getting out there and learning and getting involved. So we need to do that. That's the only way I think we can ever turn things around in this country and, you know, in this world. But Christians need to get involved. We have to stop saying, okay, well, we'll accept this, we'll accept that. Get involved politically. Get involved in your school districts. Get involved in your school systems and your local politics. Because you got to start locally and then go out. Right now, New Hampshire is done great this year. We have, you know, a Republican House and Senate, and they've passed abortion, no abortion after 24 weeks. If you're going to get abortion before 24 weeks, you have to have an ultrasound. So at least they got somewhere. They're trying to push things through. So New Hampshire's done a lot this year, but it's start in your town, start in your cities, start in your schools, and then go forward there. That's the only thing I can, you know, we start small. One person can help make changes.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add to that is that all of this is very important.
Yeah.
The but is we can't fall into what's known as the political illusion, which is the idea that the solution to all of our problems is political. This is a spiritual battle.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to keep, I have no objection to getting involved. We really should be getting involved in these kinds of things as part of our responsibility to our towns, to our culture, to our next generation. But don't lose sight of the spiritual dimensions of the battle.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask that you basically just said that earlier about our society is pretty much, I don't know if you believe this personally, is rushing towards a wholesale, or maybe like a more refined barbarism, in a sense that a wholesale collapse of civilization, if things keep getting worse. So if that's, because I was kind of like, I was reading another book regarding the collapse of Rome at the time, and how they collapsed with, was it, I believe it was Alaric, he was the guy who led the Visigoths and the so-called barbarians, right? So I'm seeing that how instead of people coming outside, I mean, there's always external, nations out there that are kind of like, adverse to our society here, but I see how it's becoming more ingrained inside of our culture, where we're actually, I think this guy is actually arguing that we're actually creating barbarians, in the sense of like, we have lost objective truth. We think that they try to assume moral high ground of like virtuous victimhood, while ignoring like the virtuous victims like of babies in the womb, right? That's like it's really insane. And so, would you say that that's the way it would come about in those three generations, as you stated earlier? Like, would it be like inside out or outside in?
Yeah, let's take a look at what happened in Rome. It's a great example. The reason why Rome collapsed, at least the western half of it collapses, what we think of as the fall of Rome, is because the culture itself had become hollowed out. It rotted from within, which opened up the door for the Germanic peoples and so on to migrate in and destroy it. Okay. I think that we're seeing a very similar process here. When you look at things like the 1619 Project, what you're seeing is something that is systematically designed to delegitimize the United States. Okay, are you familiar with 1619 Project? Okay. It's designed to delegitimize the country in the eyes of the next generation. What's going to happen when you raise kids with the idea that your country is intrinsically evil? What happens? One generation, it's gone.
Right.
We are in the process of doing that right now with things like the 1619 Project and other things. And the argument is, well, if you're not teaching this stuff, you're not teaching the truth about American history. Well, no, I don't have an objection to teaching about the warts, but you got to teach about the whole thing. And just focusing on this is no more teaching the truth of American history than making believe we were perfect is. So there are, but I think you're very much correct in your analogy. As a matter of fact, I wrote a book a while ago called Why You Think the Way You Do. And in that book, what I do, it traces the history of Western worldviews from Rome to the present, and how changing worldviews changed culture. And what I argued in there, in the conclusion, is that the Western world was created as a combination of Rome plus Christianity. When you subtract Christianity, what are you left with? Rome and all the pathologies that are associated with it. And we see that in our culture now, and we're heading down a similar kind of path. The internal self-criticism of the country, undermining like I said, the legitimacy of the country, all of those kinds of things, passing that on to the next generation, the sexual chaos, the breakdowns of families, the idea that that truth, there's no such thing really as truth. All of that kind of stuff is destroying the country. Now, my guess is that that one of a couple of things can happen from here. One of them is that the country breaks up, which is quite possible.
You mean like a mass succession of sorts? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If that happens, we won't go quietly into the good night. There will be a civil war probably. The other possibility is totalitarianism, either on the right or the left. Either as a way of trying to enforce the current orthodoxy of critical theory, or a backlash against it. Either way, it results in a totalitarianism. Those are the possible directions I see things going. But I'm much better at past history than I am at future history.
And I also have another question. I think maybe not as related, but in relation with the topic. Another thing that I kind of talk about, because I'm actually a campus evangelist, and so I go on campuses and have a lot of apologetically geared conversations, and I've just learned that. So basically, whenever the topic of I think she just brought it up about abortion comes up, right? It's essentially like what you just said in your presentation, like it's like I don't know how you worded it, but like I'm pretty much just looked at as within my class. Like you're a man, so therefore you can't say you don't have you don't have the a female reproductive organ, so therefore you can't say anything about this, or they'll just say, have you ever been pregnant? And they'll say these things, and it's like, okay, you're just basically, your entire argument is just invalidated, and so like how can, like, it's just, I know it's absurd, but it's like how do I go about, I want to be, I'm trying to be more humble, I'm trying to be more gentle, but I'm just losing my mind. I'm like, what, like, and it's like three of them at one time. It's just like, what, like,
Two
yeah.
possible responses come to mind.
Yeah.
I'm from New Jersey. The first one is, how dare you presume I'm a man?
I honestly, I said that, and I said, is it possible for me as a man to have a baby in your worldview? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, absurdity. It's just that's what I'm trying to. I'm not trying to be snarky. I'm not trying to be. It's just like, this is insane.
Yeah. Well, it is.
This is literally
the
insane.
The difference between us is I did intend to be snarky. Okay. But the other way. Have you ever been pregnant? No, but I've been a fetus.
I wish I had you with me. They would love you. They would love you.
So that basically what you want to do in these situations is one of two things. I'm always a big fan of trying to turn around and ask a question. Don't let them, if they're asking the questions, they're controlling conversation. You want to find a way to turn it around and ask them a question.
Yes, sir.
Alternately, if that doesn't work, use their own worldview against them. And I'm dead serious about that. Because both of those answers are ways of taking things that they say is true and showing them the incoherence of the argument that they're making. So it's snarky, yeah, I like that, but it also, there's a tactic involved there that's worth I think thinking about and trying to figure out how to use it. Those are sort of strategic ways of approaching it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So another question back into the long march through history. There's certain pillars of Western society, as you described, that need to be eroded or collapsed before this system can totally take hold. Like the end goal is communism. We're still a ways from that. But media, academia, I would say Christianity has to be a pillar that they're looking to topple.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Now, it doesn't seem, and I could be wrong, it doesn't seem as though the church is under the crosshairs as fiercely right now as other cultural battles, but I think that's coming. Maybe they are, but I was going to ask, how do you see the attack coming right now, and how do you see the attack maybe, and this goes to history in the future, but how do you see that attack coming?
Okay, now, I am from New Jersey. My answer about why the church isn't in the crosshairs right now is that the church is singularly ineffective and is rolling over and playing dead.
Wow.
We are not a threat. Therefore, we are ignored.
Yeah.
The only place we are a threat is when we defy mask mandates.
Wow.
I saw a statement from someone, I forgot who said this, but it was something to the effect of, what we really need are preachers whom people want to kill.
Steve Lawson.
Okay, we don't have that. We actually did a webinar on whatever happened to evangelicalism. And basically, what went wrong for us is we became popular. 1976, the year of the evangelical, according to Time magazine. You know, we became, up to about that point, evangelicals, and actually, well, I won't get into all of it, we were really sort of a very distinct minority. Everybody thinks of the 1950s as this sort of golden age of Christianity. It was the golden age of liberal Protestantism. It was not the golden age of evangelicalism. Starting in 1976, we came out of the woodwork and started becoming popular. And we got addicted to our popularity. And the net result is what you get today are churches that are so concerned with being popular, with attracting people, with making people comfortable, that a church service consists of a concert followed by a TED Talk. Wow. We need churches that are going to be the church, that are going to stand up without compromise in their preaching, in their teaching, and in their worship, because worship is warfare too.
Amen.
We need to have churches that are going to be uncompromising in those areas, because otherwise they're not a threat and they'll get ignored.
So good. Thank you.
I don't have strong opinions about things, in case you haven't noticed. Other questions? Oh.
Long walk. So you mentioned the preparing as if we are that fourth generation archbishop, and that really resonates. I think that's really astute, especially with where we are today. But I do wonder, as far as the church and its role today, should we be, what's the balance between being inwardly focused and building up a really strong foundation within communities, within church communities, in order that, in the event that that we are maybe that first generation, right? We're the ones who are going to die peacefully in our bed, and our children are going to be the ones dying in prison, our grandchildren, and so on and so forth. What is the balance that we strike of being really focused on building strong biblically based communities around the Word of God, and maybe being very visible in a culture that is growing in its animosity as opposed to its receptivity?
Okay, I think we have to work hard at building intentional communities, but they have to be communities that are open walls, so that we are, the Great Commission still applies to us. We can't be so inwardly focused that we lose the fact that we've got a mission to rescue people, to bring them into the kingdom, to introduce them to kingdom life. I would say, I'm not sure this is exactly your question, but I would say that one of the best models for doing that is to get involved in your community. Every community has needs. Every community has got problems. How can your church help address those? An example from my church in Connecticut. The deacons, most of them didn't do this, but we had one guy who actually got what deacons were about, who became the head of the deacons. And what he did is he went to the Wethersfield food pantry and said to them, "What do you need? Give me a list. What are you short of?" And they gave him a list, and he went out with a couple of guys and went to the local grocery stores. Now, you got to know Brian. Brian is, he's a biker. He's got a tattoo that starts on his scalp and finishes on his instep. He's a scary looking dude. And he had a guy with him named Chris Dukes. Chris is about this tall and about this wide, was a shot putter, and the two of these guys go to the local grocery stores, and as people are coming in, they say, "Hey, we're from First Church. We are trying to raise, get things for the Wethersfield food pantry. Here is a list of things that they need. If you would be so kind as to just buy something on this list, just buy one thing and leave it with us when you go, we'll deliver it." They had people who got entire shopping carts. Other people just bought one or two. Other people gave them money. Brian took all of the stuff to the food bank and kept the money. Now, keeping the money is important for what's about to come. So the Wethersfield Food Bank, it turns out, is now totally stocked. He calls them a couple of months later and says, You know, we were given donations, you know, some money donations. What do you need? And they said, you know, we're still really well stocked with food. What we need are personal care items, you know, soap, toothbrushes, things like that. So we went to Ocean State job lots and spent the money and just bought a boatload of that stuff and brought it in. How much of an impact do you think that's going to have on the community? How much of an impact do you think it has on the people who work at the Wethersfield Food Bank? And what he's doing there is genuinely kingdom work. Because the kingdom isn't just about personal evangelism. It's not just about me and Jesus. That's a secular vision of what the kingdom is. It's a secular vision of the gospel. In the kingdom, everything that is wrong in the world is fixed. Everything that's broken is repaired. Everything that's lost is restored. That includes people, but it also includes institutions, it includes food banks, it includes all of those kinds of things. So question, what are the needs in your community? Do you even know? And what can you do to mobilize your community to meet at least some of those needs? That's a way of simultaneously building community, doing outreach, demonstrating the love of God, all of these things together. So that would be a concrete suggestion of a way of moving forward. We do need to get engaged, certainly, in, you know, we live in a republic. We have a tremendous privilege there. We can lobby our government. We can write letters. We can get involved in elections to school boards or local councils or things like that. We can do all of those things, and all of those things are good. But as the church, there are other things that we can do that go beyond that in many ways and start having a really concrete impact right where we are.
Yeah. Thank you.
I know Derek said one last question, but I want to open it up. Is there anyone who has any other questions? Because I got one more. I can go all day. Okay. Resources. Where do we go if we want to learn more? And what are some resources maybe at various reading levels and competency levels, intro, medium, intermediate, so that we can just continue learning, continue growing in this area?
Hands down, the best book on critical theory that I've read for Christians is a book by Thaddeus Williams called Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. Excellent book because it does what few others do. It acknowledges that there are genuine problems here, but it approaches them through a biblical lens in contrast to critical theory, and he shows the difference between the two. Easily the best book on it, and it's a pretty easy read. Beyond that, Vodi Baucham's book, Fault Lines, is especially important for people in the evangelical community because it confronts us with the compromises that are taking place within the churches. Beyond that, the stuff that I've read tends to get on the rather technical side. So I'm afraid those would be the two that I would recommend more or less for general readership. If you want something that's a little more challenging, I would go with The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. That picks up on particularly the sexual revolution side of all this, explains where that comes from, what the ideas are, and why that is such a critically important part of this whole package.
I think I speak for everyone. Dr. Sunshine, thank you so much for the lecture and for answering our questions. This was great.
Thank you.
As far as right now, we're officially dismissed, but linger around, talk to Dr. Sunshine, ask some questions. And again, just thank you so much for everybody who came today. I hope that this was really helpful.